Where did this interest in economics and policy come to you? And at point of time, did you not consider joining civil services? At least for the folks who were born in 1970s, it was the most covetous job in the country.
I really think it's the best decision I made to not take the civil services.
I have a dear friend serving in the services, and in good confidence, he told me one thing: that's very hard to do good things in the country if you are in the services. I remember attending the classes during Navratra where you also started your classes with chanting. How have you combined your spirituality with public policy and economics, which is extremely rational?
Most human beings live life as if they're never going to die and die as if they never lived.
So, Professor, there are concerns about wealth disparity. We know that even if the country's growth is taking place, the urban and rural both show different pictures.
See, it's much harder to...
Hi, and welcome to yet another episode of the CEO Diary on the Shatakshi Show. In this episode, we are going to be talking to Professor Krishnamurthy Subramanian. A lot of you might already know that he has worn multiple hats, right from being the Executive Director at IMF to being a professor at ISB to of course being the former CEA, Chief Economic Advisor to Indian government. He has been to a lot of interesting public policy, economics and governance spaces. In this pod, we are going to be touching a lot of interesting topics that is going to help a lot of young professionals like you who are in the age bracket of 20 till 35, and we are going to be discussing a lot of topics around him growing up in the India of 1970s, his spirituality, his philosophy, how does he stay true on his grounds, why did he decide to write a book on India such as the title is called India at 100, and of course a lot of tricky questions or situations that come up in the newspaper around global economics and of course the Indian economics as well. And needless to say, if you enjoyed this episode of the Shatakshi Show on the CEO Diary, feel free to give a thumbs up and of course share it with your friends and family members who you believe are going to be getting a lot of learning from this show. I hope you like this one.
So, welcome Professor Krishnamurthy on the CEO Diary podcast. Certainly an honor, and it's a serendipity moment for me given I've taken classes from you. So it's a Guru Shishya moment for me as well. And the world of course knows you from multiple hats you have worn: Professor at ISB, the Chief Economic Advisor, and of course the Executive Director at IMF. But I would certainly love if you could introduce yourself in your own words, and then we'll take it forward from there.
I am a common person who has actually got the privilege to serve the nation, at a time when the global economy was going through a difficult time, having, had the privilege to be the 17th Chief Economic Advisor of the country. I come from a very humble background, lower middle class family. My father worked in the Indian Railways, and I grew up in Type 2 quarters in Bilaspur and Durg, and was the first person in my family to go to university because of the hard work that my parents did. They chose to send me to English medium schools when they had to pay almost a quarter of of my father's salary as just fees. Quarter, I mean, that's a large, but they chose to invest in mine and my brother's education. So here I am as a result of the sacrifices that they made, living a dream, in some sense, an Indian dream.
Very beautiful. This sort of reminded me of my own father. I always think that there has to be one generation that has to really go out there and take certain risks. My father also served in public sector unit. So I would really want to go back to the past and really understand your childhood a little bit in depth. So I suppose this is India of 1970s. When did you grow up?
Yeah.
What was your childhood like? And what were dinner table discussions with your parents? What hobbies did you pursue? Did you have dreams? So on and so forth.
Firstly, we didn't have a dinner table. We used to sit on the floor and eat for large parts. I think the first time that we got a dinner table must have been, when we really sat down. We used to sit down in the floor and eat, and not just during the dinner table, but my father, was someone who loved sharing his experiences. He came up the hard way, struggled through. He was the eighth child in his family, and that's why he was named Krishnamurthy, Krishna, being the eighth one. So that's my father's name. He lost his father when he was just 7 years old, and then could finish school because of the largesse of his his elder brother and an elder sister. And so he used to oftentimes share a lot of the struggles that he went through. And I think a lot of conversation used to be about that. Conversation also used to be about importance of values. My father emphasized that a lot. Importance of hard work and not cutting corners, things like that. He used to, and I think also many times he used to plant those dreams in our minds, in our young minds. When I think some of my earliest, I remember maybe I must have been in class 3 or class 4, and my brother was 2 years younger, maybe class 1 or class 2. My father mentioned that I want you to become a doctor, and I want my brother him to become an engineer. So, and then he would list out all these degrees. He said, he would say MBBS, MD, FRCS, all those degrees he would list out for. Those are all you should be getting. You should look to get all those degrees. That's the kind of. So yeah, education was always something that he emphasized. One of my vivid memories is for the first time when I started learning Sanskrit. It was in class 6. He gave me his pocket Bhagavad Gita. He used to carry that, and asked me to read some shlokas from the Bhagavad Gita. I remember I struggled to read it because this was just I was just learning conjugation in Sanskrit, that phalam phale phalani, that stuff, and here I was trying to read a full shloka. I remember struggling, but that was my exposure to basically the to the wealth of knowledge that our culture provides. And I think one thing that I've actually been incredibly grateful for is how my father was a very wise man. As soon as I got into IIT, he realized that I'm going to be part of the country's elite, and so he somehow, and he used to say this very often, that he used to find among his generation's elite, he used to find them all far too enamored by Western ideas, Western values, everything Western, and he didn't want me and my brother to become like that. And so he would highlight a lot of things, share about how what is the depth of Indian thought, what is the depth of in terms, not just in spiritual aspects, but even in math, science, and stuff like that. So that was our exposure. So I think a lot of education beyond beyond school. And he would talk about how the ability, having the resilience to be able to get through difficulties. So a lot of life lessons learned. From both my mother and my father. My mom, actually, I remember, she wouldn't advise very often, but when she did, I think she would say something very, very profound. I think I must remember, I think I would have been in class 9 or so. I used to be far too much of a happy-go-lucky kind of kid. And my mom mentioned that if you in some sense, later I sort of understood it as a trade-off. She didn't put it as a trade-off. She said, you have a choice. If you want to, next 10 years, if you want to enjoy yourself, then be ready for the next 40 years of struggle. But if the next 10 years, if you work hard, then you'll have next 40 years of people appreciating you, you achieving all that. So the choice is yours. And I thought that was something that stuck with me. And low middle class family. I'm sure there are so many people in India who have stories like these to share. Mine is just one among them. And I think the importance of education, the importance of values, and particularly I think the importance of being able to appreciate what being an Indian really means. Unlike the English educated elite, in our country, who very often seem to be far too enamored by everything Western. I really thank my parents for having actually inculcated, and in a right way, actually having understood the strength of the Indian ethos. I've actually appreciated it very much. Yeah, I mean, lots of very, very nice conversations. Oftentimes I guess people will say serious conversations, but yeah, that's what I gathered.
Very beautiful. And how do your parents feel right now?
So my dad is not there anymore. He passed away in 2015. Yeah, my mom, of course, she's I think one of the things my mom sort of implied when I became the chief economic advisor is that, she'll really test what she's taught me when I finish as the CEA, essentially saying, can you handle success? And can you handle success and be the same person as you were before, not let success get to your head. She always basically taught, she always taught that don't respect the status of the person, respect the human being. So as the chief economic advisor, I've had people, some of my colleagues who are not necessarily those that were, IAS officers or IES officers, or, I've gone to their houses as well, and these are very. I remember this particular. He was a Class B officer whose father was, father basically was a tailor, and he. So by being a tailor, he taught him and actually joined joined government service. So this person would teach all youngsters to clear competitive examinations. He invited me, and I went to their place, and actually, so those things like that, these are things that that my mother taught me, which is that, and I actually have learned therefore that I think failure doesn't test as much a person as your character as well as success does. Success tests you far better if you. And that's what the import of what my mother taught me was, if success gets to your head, then I think you've failed that test of character.
Very beautiful. I think it's a very enriching perspective, because the common notion these days has become that failure, of course, failure also teaches a great deal of integrity and values. So we go back to once again the young Subramaniam. You are in IIT. We're talking about these services, UPSC, IAS, IFS. Where did this interest in economics and policy come to you? And if it came, then at point of time, did you not consider joining civil services? At least for the folks who were born in 1970s, it was the most covetous job in the country.
So I did consider it at some point, but I think when I look back, I really think it's the best decision I made to not take the civil services. I think it helped that I joined IIT in the early 90s. 1991 liberalization happened, and as a result the economy opened up as well. So I'd like to thank Arun Shourie, who was the disinvestment minister later. He had come to deliver the Vijay Kelkar memorial lecture. Or Kelkar, I don't think it's just Kelkar, first director of IIT Kanpur. So he had come to deliver that lecture, and I remember having I was part of a small group that was actually involved, in having him there, and I remember mentioning to him at that time. I think I was in my third year at IIT, and I did express my an interest, and he said, the IITs are an oasis. Don't basically spoil yourself by joining the civil services. He said, I've seen it from very close quarters. Go let your talent flower in the private sector. And I think I thank him for, because I took that advice actually quite seriously, and I think it helped a lot in I think I've benefited a lot from being in the private sector, and Yeah, I think at some point maybe I might have thought about it, but I felt that the private sector actually it really recognizes talent far better, rewards talent much better, and so as a result of maybe that indoctrination, I've never found the civil services to be that coveted.
Fair enough. I have a dear friend serving in the services, and in good confidence, he told me one thing, that's very hard to do good things in the country if you are in the services. He actually felt that if you do good, you are rather disincentivized. And of course, I'll not share the name because he told me in good confidence. I would want to go back to spirituality because you mentioned this as part of your introduction and as part of your upbringing, and as someone who has attended your classes also. I think there was a clear, palpable indication that you have been really deeply spiritual. I remember attending the classes during Navratra where you also started your classes with chanting. How have you combined your spirituality with public policy and economics, which is extremely rational and data-oriented sector? Have they both come together? Or has spirituality ever impacted your decision making in a world which has to be ideally extremely data-oriented?
It's a very good question. So, underlying the question is the implicit belief that, spirituality and scholarship possibly don't go together. That's sort of an implicit belief. If anything, in my opinion, the two have complemented, each other really well. So one of the things that I've felt is, to live a balanced life, I think the balance between the head and the heart, I think, is really important. And I think most scholars, most intellectuals are far too stuck in the head. And I think, spirituality adds so many dimensions to, to a personality. I think first thing, it basically reminds you, as a result of my sort of spiritual pursuits, I actually understood that most human beings live life as if they're never going to die, and die as if they never lived. And I think being aware of your own mortality, and also being aware of how small a speck of dust we are in the cosmic scheme of things, I think helps us to keep grounded. I find oftentimes scholars being far too arrogant, and yet think about it, actually, there have been so many scholars that have walked this earth before, and there will be so many scholars that will walk this earth after you as well. What is the big deal, actually? Even if, let's say, there is, you're some named person or whatever, time essentially destroys everything. I was seeing this wonderful video the other day, where this was a video about Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji. And, Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji was a big devotee of Satya Sai Baba. And so after Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji, was not the Prime Minister anymore, when Satya Sai Baba ji was alive, he went to see Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji. This was when he was not the Prime Minister anymore, just ex-PM. And, Satya Sai Baba ji then mentions that, look, this was the place that used to be chock-a-block with people. Now there is nobody. And I think that is the reality. I've seen, for instance, in the similar way in the Hyderabad airport, I've seen former RBI governors, who are coming from internationally. They're picking up their luggage themselves. These were people who used to have a retinue of people running after them when they were governors. So I think that aspect, that eventually everything stops. There is an end time to ये समय भी गुजरेगा, या अच्छा समय हो या बुरा समय हो, दोनों गुजरेगा.
I'm smiling ear to ear because I had to pick up a philosophy book this year to read, and rather than running towards the Western philosophers, I decided to pick up Bhagavad Gita, and I think I've just completed 10% of it, and I see a lot of underpinnings in your answers coming from Bhagavad Gita. I already have a lot of curiosities on heavy words such as, like, what is happiness, what is spirituality. These are really, if we start discussing about them, there will be a start of a new conversation. I also think that the misery of it all is just being obsessed over one own self, that I am someone. If we think we are part of a larger collective, then the misery could go away. I have another question, maybe tying science and spirituality, and you are kind of combining it too as a logical thinking concept. Do you think life is a set of random events?
Wow, that's a very difficult. So I'm actually I'll refer to something that I had read long back. This was very nice lecture by Swami Vivekananda. So everybody knows, of course, Swami Vivekananda's address at the Parliament of Religions, but he, when he was in the US, he gave other speeches as well. One of the speeches that he gave, influenced me enormously. He said, precisely to this question about, is life a sequence of random events? So I'll before I describe that speech, I want to mention something else. Another piece of wonderful spiritual piece that I had read. This is the seer or the saint of Kanchipuram is basically called Mahaperiva. Is Chandrasekharan Saraswati. He lived to almost, he was almost 100, actually 99. He died when he was 99 years old. My father actually was a big devotee of his, and so I was introduced to his thoughts. I read on one occasion, a French journalist came to Mahaperiva, and said, Swamiji, in Indian philosophy, you have this concept of rebirth and soul and all those things. How do you even rationalize that? I think it's just basically this entire concept of soul and rebirth and all that. I think is just, in my opinion, is basically bogus. Is what. So this is what he tells Mahaperiva. So Mahaperiva then says, okay, do you have a car or a vehicle with you? He says, yes, I do have. I have a car with me. So he says, can you do me a small job? He says, sure. The journalist. So Mahaperiva says, do one thing. Can you actually just go around the hospitals in Kanchipuram? And in the next 2 hours, just find out the babies that have been born. Look at those that are just born. Then ask their parents' details and come back and report to me. So this person does as directed. The journalist, he goes and he finds there are 3 babies that have been born. The first baby was born in the general ward of a government hospital. And when he inquires, he finds out that this baby is basically born to to slum dwellers in Kanchipuram. Their second baby that is born actually is in a government hospital, but not in a general ward, but in one of the rooms there. And when he inquires, he finds that these babies actually have been that baby is born to government servants. These are basically, the father is a government servant, the mother is a housewife, and the third baby that is born in a private nursing home. And when he inquires, actually finds out that very rich parents, and so he comes back and reports. Then so when he reports, and then Mahaperiva asks this journalist, now, can you, sort of picturize for me how the life of these 3 kids will look like, 3 babies will look like? He says, yeah, that's not rocket science. I think the baby that's been born to slum dwellers, will struggle with life, will even struggle for basic necessities of food, shelter, etc. The baby that's been born to government servant, the government servant, he's not an officer or anything. Actually, he's a sort of a class 3 employee, and he'll also become maybe a employee, work in a government. He'll have a hand to mouth existence. Basically, but he'll not struggle for food and shelter, etc. He'll have a. And then the third kid that's been born to very rich parents, actually, I'm sure he'll have a fantastic life. He actually has money. He will maybe he'll get educated. Maybe he'll basically or otherwise also he'll not have any want. He'll have a very good materially rich life. So then Mahapariva says, okay, I agree with you. He says then. But do you think that these 3 babies have done any actions, in their current birth to basically explain such drastic differences in how their life is going to pan out? So the journalist says, no, I only saw one of the babies was actually sleeping, another baby was crying, a third baby was drinking milk from the mother, and so he says, apart from maybe having drunk milk once, maybe, and taken a few breaths and maybe slept, they've not done any actions. So then Mahapariva asks, then says, how is it that so it can't clearly be that any of the actions that they've done in this life, that is what is leading to to such differences in their lives. Then he says, no. So how do you explain that? He says, oh, it's just a lottery of life, where you're born is as a lottery. Then Mahapariva says, is that really a theory that you actually have? It's basically random. That can't be. And then he said, then Mahapariva then pushes him and says that, do you think if there was a divine, that the divine would be so partial that would give such a wonderful life to one baby and such a poor life to another baby? If there was such a divine who's actually so partial, I wouldn't even want to call that divine, because you attribute all the qualities with omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent. Those are the qualities you attribute with the divine. That divine cannot be partial for sure. So then Mahapariva says, refers to this speech of Swami Vivekananda. And in that speech, Swami Vivekananda logically reasons it out like this, saying, if you look at basically the lives of people, they are so different. One person is very happy, another person not so happy. He says it can't be. The divine, cannot be a partial being. It has to have, if it has to have all the other qualities, it also has to have the quality of impartiality. Then he says it has to be this particular soul's whatever they've done in their previous life. That is what is what we call prarabdha karma. So that is what is manifesting as. So that's my explanation, actually, a Vedantic explanation for. And I think in the Bhagavad Gita as well, Shri Krishna explains this beautifully. He says that he says, for instance, this body that you have is basically but a coat that you're wearing. You've worn different colors of coats. In other lives, actually, your soul is permanent. Your life, it is impermanent. You'll actually, when it wears off, you will basically, you'll shed these clothes and you'll wear a new clothes. So I actually, therefore, do not think about, let me put it this way, that a theory basically where everything is random is not really a theory. So if basically, if you look from the perspective of, let's say, saying only one life, and then, how do you explain such differences in lives, in what people, so there has to be something deeper than that. I think that's the second explanation I'll give you is what I've again understood as, so I'm bringing my scientific temper together with basically, spirituality together. One of the fundamental principles or theories that we learn in physics is the, law of conservation of energy. And we, for instance, learn that, kinetic energy and potential energy are just, so energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed. For instance, from kinetic to potential to kinetic, like that. So this is my understanding. I don't know whether others basically have talked about it like this, but my understanding is that for instance, if you take someone like APJ Abdul Kalam ji, right? APJ Abdul Kalam ji was giving a speech on stage, and he dropped dead. So just the second before he dropped dead, obviously there was a lot of kinetic energy in him, right? He was speaking. It was coming out as sound energy. It was coming out as mechanical energy in his hands, etc. And all of a sudden he drops dead. So obviously all that kinetic energy is gone. Now, if it is the case that energy cannot be created or destroyed, that energy that was there in APJ Abdul Kalam ji obviously did not get destroyed. It just got what was kinetic energy has gotten transformed into potential energy. And that potential energy is basically what then will manifest as potential energy in his next life, which again, think about it. Actually, what I just explained using the example of Mahaparivar, related it with Swami Vivekananda's speech, and so from the Bhagavad Gita, and the law of conservation. If you see all of them, there is absolutely no dissonance with any of this. They're all absolutely consistent with each other. 4 different ways of looking at it. As I said, that particular anecdote of 3 babies, relating it with Swami Vivekananda's speech on God not being partial, relating it with with Bhagavad Gita, what Krishna talks about, basically your soul getting just wearing different clothes, and with the law of conservation of energy. Right now kinetic energy getting transformed into potential energy and then manifest in the next life. So these are all absolutely consistent with each other. There are no internal contradictions with any of this. That is a theory. That is, randomness is not a theory.
Very interesting. If I'm not wrong, I think former physicist Einstein would also agree with you, because he fought till his last breath to prove that general universe is not random set of events. I think Stephen Hawking was on the other side. He wanted to prove that it was a series of random events. So, Professor, we'll switch levers and now talk a little bit about economics, both at a global and at a national level. So there are many economists and leading industrialists such as Ray Dalio and Nouriel Roubini, who actually predicted the 2008 financial crisis. They have expressed concern rather with respect to overprinting of money. And in fact, overprinting of money historically, in fact, with the Roman Empire or even with the Byzantine Empire, has led to economic collapse. Do you think with US, UK, and many other Western nation countries which are overprinting of money, for the audience, it can lead to inflation? Do you think that could eventually lead to a global economic collapse? And if not, are these dangers overstated? Or do you think there are real dangers to the global economy which can eventually impact the Indian economy as well?
Very good question. Actually, you've sort of embedded 2-3 questions into one question here. Firstly, I want to use the economic performance that India had during COVID vis-a-vis that of advanced economies to actually to explain what you just spoke about. India, for instance, did not print money like there's no tomorrow. India was far more frugal in its spending. The advanced economies, especially the United States, in contrast, did spend like there is no tomorrow. And that led to inflation that is, that was about, anywhere between 2.5 to 4 times, its historical average, each one of the advanced economies, G7 economies. In contrast, during that same period, India's inflation was about 90% of its historical average. So I think that is something which is clearly illustrative of the fact that if you have too much money chasing only so much so much output, then obviously you have inflation. So now there may be a possibility of some not right now. I think the economy actually is sort of global economy is coming into a soft landing, but it's possible that sometime in the future there may be. But I think the important thing to understand is that the impact on the Indian economy may not be very large, and here's where I think when we think about this rigorously, right, you'll start understanding this. So go back to your macroeconomics classes, and those who are listening as well. If you think about GDP has basically, you have consumption, you have investment, you have government spending, and you have net exports. In the Indian context, consumption accounts for about 60% of GDP. Investment accounts for about 30% of GDP. Government spending accounts for about 10% of GDP. Net exports basically is net exports, which is exports minus imports. barely, and if anything, it's actually negative, because imports are higher than exports, right? So if you see here, almost the entire, part of GDP consumption is domestic. Investment, about 1.5 to maybe 1.5, even if, right now, if you look at of investment, about 1.5% of GDP is FDI, but domestic investment is about 30%. So there as well, domestic is far more, many times actually that of foreign investment. Government spending, of course, is domestic. So if you put it together, you start seeing that, we end up projecting the impact of the global economy on India far too much than is demanded by rigorous thinking. I think, as I like saying, it's Hawabaji, that saying that, global economy, yes, maybe there'll be an impact on sentiment. But even that impact on sentiment, I think, is because we overestimate the impact of the global economy. If you start seeing that, almost entire of GDP is domestic factors, then you'll be able to understand that the global economy doesn't have, for an economy as large as India, I think the impact of the global economy is not likely to be as large.
I have a challenge, or rather a loophole that I'm witnessing, and it would be helpful if you could figure this out. So for example, Amazon is firing people in thousands, right? There are multinational corporations based out of India as well. So if there will be a global recession, then eventually the multinational companies will lay off people here in India, with having their headquarters in New Delhi, Mumbai as well, which could eventually impact the consumption of the people, assuming that they didn't have a lot of saving, or even if they had for dry day, they will not be consuming with the same frequency as they're doing right now. So how would you tackle that counter challenge that could come to this argument? I'm thinking out loud right now.
Yes. So firstly here, I think there are some perceptions that I want to correct here. For one, you gave the example of Amazon, or I think many of this is not about, there is no global recession now, by the way. If anything, the GDP growth, global economy is basically is in growing by about 2% odd. So there is no recession globally, number one. Second, these many of these job losses, if any, are actually because of the advent of AI. And I think, unlike previous technological shocks, which actually affected blue collar jobs far more, AI will impact white collar jobs, especially software coding, and that's why. So it is wrong to attribute it to the global economy. It actually far more of, the impact of technological change.
In the interest of time, maybe we'll have two last questions. From global, we'll move to a more national outlook. So, Professor, there are concerns about wealth disparity, especially in terms of taxation. So if I'm not wrong, in 2019, there was a tax cut on the corporate indirect tax as well. On the top of it, there is a general notion coming from newspapers and general media, or just the general, I would say, sentiment as well, where people feel that they are being unfairly taxed more for the services that the government is not providing. For example, you send your kids to private school, you send your parents to private hospitals. On the road, there is another toll and taxation that's taking place, property tax, so on and so forth. So how do you want to address these two questions? One, around the larger wealth disparity that's coming in the country. We know that even if the growth is taking place, the urban and rural both show different picture. And then, of course, I would want your view on the larger sentiment on getting taxed a lot and not getting for the fair share of services.
See, it's much harder to measure wealth inequality, because you need to have a full survey of everybody's wealth. That's much harder. And let me tell you, the whatever article that Thomas Piketty has written using taxpayers' data, that is so poorly done, because tax, only 6 to 7% or maybe 8% or less than 10% of the population pays taxes. You need heroic assumptions. You need to make heroic assumptions to infer from basically getting data on 10% of the population, and then to actually assess the wealth of the remaining 90% of the population, and then say something about inequality. You can see clearly that you need absolutely heroic assumptions. I do not trust one bit of whatever their findings there are, because I think it's just it's clearly ideological, not very rigorous. So I don't think wealth inequality, actually we have very good measures for that. yet. I mean, we have actually in India, but I think some of that is dated. It's not something that. So the recent data that we have is on consumption inequality, which has clearly shown that it has actually declined significantly. Also, if you look at, there's been in the last 10 years, growth has been quite inclusive. Through the creation of Jan Dhan bank account, more than 500 million bank accounts. The Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, mobile, welfare spending has become far more efficient. If you look at the Ayushman Bharat, for instance, for the first time in 75 years, the private spending, out-of-pocket spending on healthcare actually has become less than public spending, and that's what should happen. If you look at what has happened through Swachh Bharat, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, look at employment actually, and that's where RBI has this report basically using the CLEMS database. A lot of the poor narratives on employment actually come using the unreliable CMI data. But if you're using the CLEMS database, high quality database, RBI's report shows that 9 crore jobs have been created overall, overall 12.5 crores with 3.5 crores in agriculture, 9 crore jobs in the last 10 years. So when you put all this together, there's been far more inclusive growth. Of course, those people that are consumed by ideology, do not want to recognize, these data. If you look at even on innovation, entrepreneurship, from 2004 to 2014, new firm creation using World Bank data used to grow at 3.2% per annum. From 2014 onwards, entrepreneurship is growing at orders of magnitude higher. We have the third largest entrepreneurial ecosystem with more than 120 unicorns. In 2015, on the Global Innovation Index, we were 85th ranked. Now we're ranked 39th. Look at, Nature has an article now showing how the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, which actually, many people poo-pooed when the Honorable Prime Minister spoke about it in 2014 in his first Independence Day address, has actually reduced, all kinds of deaths. So I think it is people's ideology, and especially the English educated elites' ideological leanings that actually makes them not recognize the undoubted progress that has been made, inclusive growth that has happened, which speaks to obviously inequality. If you've had inclusive growth, then I think if actually a well done study is done on wealth inequality, I would actually like to think that that has not definitely increased. Because if you look at another metric, poverty, for instance, using the World Bank $1.9 per capita per day line, from 12.2%, which is what the abject poverty was actually percentage, 12.2% in 2012, it has come down to 2.2%. Put all this together, you start seeing that clearly there's been economic progress, not just for a few, but actually for a lot of people. And let me address this, because many people say, a few corporates are benefiting. I have two arguments for that. First, if you look at basically, if you take, let's say, Apple, from 2000 to 2020, Apple's market cap increased orders of magnitude from about 20 billion to 3 trillion. Now during that period, US GDP has basically maybe grown by maybe four times, maybe 3-4 times, and so then would you say basically that Apple has benefited from cronyism? No, of course not, right? The second point I want to say actually, and as a professor, in terms of opportunity for learning, let's say, I give the equal opportunity to everybody in my class, 75 students in a class. But there are basically some students pick that up much better because they actually spot the opportunity and work hard to avail that opportunity, and others don't. Similarly, there are corporates that are actually utilizing these opportunities. They're working harder, they're putting in much better business models. To attribute all of that to cronyism, I think is basically not being, that's not consistent with economic arguments or with data.
Got it. Fair enough. I am now thinking about the potential challenges of making sure right data should reach the right audience. But of course, this is almost the wrap up of this pod. And with that, I wanted to ask you one last question about your book, which is about India at 100. My only one question to you, Professor, is why did you decide to write a book? Why on this topic only? And why do you think this was the right time because of which you decided to write a book at this point of time in your career?
So firstly, during my time as the chief economic advisor from 2018 to 2021, when I joined in December 2018, after that, because of the, banking sector problems, preceding me, GDP growth started basically declining. And so, the 3 years, and then COVID came, and I was there in government during a period where, every commentator always choose to highlight negatives about the Indian economy. And I think far more negative commentary than positive commentary. And actually, and I think I've firmly believed that whether it is an individual or an institution or the country, much like humans are imperfect, right? So we all have negatives, but we all have a lot of positives as well. And among individuals, I like focusing on their positives, not on their negatives. In a similar way, for me also, for an institution or the country as well, I like focusing on the positives, not just keep running down, by just highlighting the negatives are the same. So because the reason I say this is, for positive outcomes to manifest, positive thinking is necessary. But for negative outcomes to manifest, negative thinking is sufficient. And during my period, time as well, and COVID, there were a lot of commentators who were providing, this sufficient condition left, right, and center. So I felt, therefore, that positive thinking has to work harder. I saw a lot of positives in the Indian economy. I still see a lot of positives in the economy. So I wanted to actually put them down. Number one, that's the second. I think it is important to also, I felt that when I was in the last year of my stint with the government, the India at 75 celebrations were happening. So obviously naturally my thoughts went to what Indian economy will look when we turn 100, and that was the second motivation. Third motivation was also to actually, in a balanced manner, lay out what are the things we need to do, to basically get to become an economic powerhouse, to realize our potential. For instance, I like using this example. In 1993, Sachin Tendulkar, when he had played cricket for a few years, Sunil Gavaskar said, Sachin Tendulkar will basically, if he doesn't score at least 30 international hundreds and at least 15,000 international runs, I'll be very disappointed. He was assessing his potential, but obviously Sachin had to work hard to realize that potential, right? In a similar way, Indian economy has the potential, but Indian economy and Indian policymakers in particular need to work hard to realize that potential. So across 27 chapters, I wanted to lay out what is that hard work that India needs to do, what are the policies that we need to implement, and that was the part of the reason actually. So to lay this out, and I think finally I've come to believe that a cynic looks at always looks at the challenges underlying an opportunity. A visionary looks at the opportunities underlying a challenge. In assessing India's economic potential, I wanted to actually focus on the opportunities that underlie the challenges. There are challenges, but there are enormous opportunities in those challenges as well. That was the basic motivation for writing the book.
Very beautiful. So you might not know, I was born in 91, exactly the year when India was liberalized. And I have served the Narendra Modi ji government and Indian government for 2 years. And I've seen up close how hard work everyone was doing to improve the governance of the country. So I'm a huge advocate of the governance and of the India story. Congratulations on this book, and thank you so much for taking out the time. If you have any last words for our young audience and young minds, this would be it.
Maybe I just, request youngsters to take a look at my TED Talk, where I've laid out this sort of a formula, if you will, which is, and I've sort of explained that as the number of successes in life is equal to number of attempts times the probability of success given an attempt. And number of attempts is something that is a function of our attitude. Even the probability of success is also over a more longer run actually is also a function of our attitude, of how we want to grow and learn as individuals. So I would urge youngsters to take a look at that at that TED Talk of mine. It's on YouTube. I think that might give some perspective.
I'm sure it will. Here's to having multiple attempts in life, and maybe here's to finding an internal compass for happiness as well, given we had so much chat around happiness.